go live. So I don't know if it's gonna work. Oh well, it may work. It may not work. It doesn't. I don't know how to do it actually. So forget it. All right, here we go. Ed, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. It's really exciting to be here and talk about Gladiator.
Yeah. So I actually, full disclosure, I was at the movie theater. I have this local movie theater in my neighborhood. It's pretty great in Philadelphia. $6 on Tuesdays. So I went to see Gladiator, and I texted you in the first few minutes of the film. I said, this would be a great podcast. I know one of the best ancient historians in the country, in the world. Would you say you're world class? Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but about Gladiator, there are many of us who can talk about it, but few.
No,
I think,
hey,
with the
there's only
passion.
one historian I want to talk about it with, Ed, and that is you. So yeah, I texted you, and so this takes place 16 years after the last film. I should just say, by the way, I mean, this is so cliche, but there's probably spoiler alerts. I mean, so spoiler alerts. So if you haven't seen the film, we might ruin some of it. Right. I mean, that's just a caveat, because you can't be too coy and careful when we're talking about a film, right?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I have a really bad history of that. I'll give you an anecdote. I was teaching a class, and as an aside, I mentioned the Thanos snap in right when the first part of that sequence came out, the Marvel movie, and no one in the class had seen it because I'd seen it on opening night, and I just mentioned it, and literally 200 people groaned. Like, you just ruined the entire movie for us.
You
So
went to
I'm bad
see
that way.
the Avengers on the I'm in a comic book opening night movie guy, but I wouldn't picture you as
Oh my
do you do that
God.
for
So
DC or just Marvel?
no, just Marvel. I'm not into the DC, the DCs are too kind of ultra, like Superman. You can't identify with Superman, right? There's no flaws there. But like Spider-Man, you totally can see Spider-Man and identify with this. But my daughter and I have this thing. Whenever I finish a book, we watch all of the Avengers movies in chronological order.
Wow, how long does that take?
Days. So we started this during the pandemic, and we would lock ourselves in and order pizzas and just binge it and sleep 8 hours and then keep binging it. And it took us like 3 or 4 days to do the whole sequence. Yeah, so this is our thing. We're totally into this.
I mean, that's interesting. That sounds like good parenting to me, but I don't know. But I'm a comic book geek kind of guy, so I mean but that seems like a fantastic bonding experience. So, yeah, I agree with you about DC stuff. I think there's a little bit of Superman. Why do you need the rest of the Justice League? What problem couldn't Superman solve? Like, why would you
Yeah,
need any of them?
exactly.
Although
Exactly. And
Batman can consistently beat Superman, just outsmarting him.
well, okay, yeah, Superman is not smart. That's true. But the Batman sequence, I mean, I really loved the Christian Bale sequence. But why does every Batman have to start with the origin story again and again and again? We've had 40 years of Batman movies, right? And there's always the origin story. And all right, I just think Marvel does it better.
Well, you know what's
Even
interesting?
with the detours.
They did skip the origin. The Matt Reeves most recent Batman story skipped the origin. There was
True.
and Michael Keaton really. I guess you did get flashbacks. Yeah, but I mean, I think the best, still in my mind, the best comic book adaptation for me is still the Daredevil series. I think that is so
Really?
well done to the comic book, to the character. I think
So
that
you
is
look over
great.
my head. You got Jessica Jones, right? The
Yeah,
Alias. So like that's a gift from my daughter. That's the first, the first appearance of Jessica Jones. That show was good. They did a,
Jessica Jones is great.
there's so little Jessica Jones material because she's just totally like she just doesn't ever she never breaks out of the like secondary character thing. But the show was it was good. So that was I think my favorite of that the Defender series.
Yeah, I really like the whole gritty sort of New York portrayal in Daredevil and then the Defenders. I mean, that's an yeah, the other thing that is interesting about the DC movies. I can't believe we're talking about this, but it's fine. My audience will probably love this. But
We're doing movies, right?
I think as great as the Nolan Batman movies were, they couldn't bring the rest of the universe into it. Like when they make a great Batman movie, it's almost like they have to take out the rest of the DC universe and make it no metahumans, no superpowers. They're doing the same thing with the Matt Reeves Batman. The Penguin, the Penguin was quite good actually. I watched that series recently, and that was excellent. But again, that universe can't contain Wonder Woman or Superman, and I think Marvel does this pretty well. Bringing in power heroes at different power levels, people that fight
Yeah.
gods, and people like Daredevil who are just blind ninjas, and they're all existing in this same universe in a coherent way, which I think makes it superior.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, and the fact that you can kind of interchange them and insert them in. I do think that it's interesting to see because of the splitting up of the Marvel franchises, and especially the whole like Sony group that they got the best, right? And so then you get the sort of second tier stuff that Disney was doing, and now they're kind of coming back together. Um, I think that really, in a way, facilitated better storytelling because you had to deal with like third tier heroes. Like I mean, you said you're a comic book guy. Like I don't know enough about comic books to say this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that a first edition Iron Man was worth like exponentially less before before Robert Downey
Iron
Jr.
Man was my
And
favorite character growing up, and
seriously,
that yes, that was amazing. Yes, I would collect Iron Man for years. I bought every Iron Man comic, and I remember Iron Man 200 when it came out, where Tony Stark puts the armor back on and fights Obadiah Stane, who has that big armor. I mean, they do that really well.
yeah.
Yeah, Iron Man was my favorite Marvel hero, and so I was thrilled when they cast Robert Downey Jr. So I'm like the one guy who loved Iron Man.
Wait, so what happened to the prices when Iron Man became like instead of like third tier, he became central? Like, did this shoot
I
through the
don't read
roof
comics
or?
anymore. I don't buy comics anymore,
Oh,
so I don't
okay.
know. But it was a great moment for me, glorious. I always wonder why Batman didn't become Iron Man in the sense of, it's interesting. I just read, now I get all these comic book Facebook things in my feed. And there was apparently this Hellbat suit that Batman had that combined the powers of all the Justice League and was like Iron Man on steroids. And I'm like, why doesn't he just wear that every day? like, like, why are you running around with a grappling gun when you could fly and do heat vision and all this other stuff? So I guess he only breaks it out like in emergencies.
I guess. I don't know. I mean, I did like the one thing that I loved about the Christian Bale Batman is like in the movie with Bane, where he goes to the doctor and the doctor like looks at his X-rays and is like, "Dude, you have no cartilage anywhere." Like
Anywhere.
you really, and it's like that was the one moment where you're like, "Wow, okay, this is real." You're right. Like they're actually pretending that Batman is real, as opposed to every other Batman ever, right?
The best part of, I guess, the Justice League movie was when Flash asks Bruce Wayne, of course, played by Ben Affleck, well, what are your superpowers? And he just turns and he goes, I'm rich. Which is, I mean, I guess that bodes well for Elon Musk. Maybe he'll make a bat suit or something.
He's got to go to the gym a little more, I think,
Got to
before
go to the gym.
that
I don't know if
suit's
he's
gonna work.
altruistic enough. I don't know if he's altruistic enough of a personality to do that. So let's get to Gladiator 2. All right,
Yeah,
here we
yeah.
have. So this takes place 16 years after the uh, first film, where Commodus is the character played by Commodus, or I'm sorry, the character Commodus played by oh
Joaquin,
Joaquin
yeah.
Phoenix. He's deposed. We get apparently, I guess, several transitional emperors, and then we get this pair of psychotic twins as the emperor, like 16 years later. Okay, now Maximus, the character in the first movie, right, was based loosely on an actual general, right? Is that true?
I
I
mean,
mean, loosely. I mean, very loosely.
unidentifiably, yeah, like
Yeah.
unidentifiably, but yeah, kind of, sorta. Uh, so the issue in the first film is that Commodus is super young when he takes over, and there's
He was like he
no,
was 16 or something, right? What
yeah, he's
wasn't
a
he when he took over?
teenager, but there's no question about him taking over because
By the way,
he's
Ed,
been,
how impressed are you that I knew that Commodus was like 16? I mean, come
I
on.
love it.
Not an ancient historian.
Yeah, so so basically, like, there's this whole thing when you get into the Byzantine Empire. It's called a porphyrogenitus, which is somebody born to a reigning emperor in this purple room in the imperial palace, right? And so it like connotes this idea of like you are the most legitimate of legitimate, people to inherit the throne. Commodus is the first. I mean, it's not, the porphyrogenitus, the porphyry purple room doesn't exist. The capital Constantinople doesn't exist, but Commodus is the first person ever born to a reigning Roman emperor who lives to maturity and is able to take over. And so, so there is no question that he's going to be the successor, right? There's no question. Um, and he actually starts out as like a kind of uninspired guy, but like, okay, everybody is on board with this. And then Lucilla, his sister, who is, in both movies, um, she organizes a coup to try to kill him. And, and this basically has a whole bunch of knockoff effects where the coup is like ridiculous. She hires, some senator, like comic books, is supposed to kill Commodus as he's walking into the Colosseum. And he jumps out with a knife and he says, the Senate, sends this. And it's like, dumb Bond villain sort of comic book stuff, right? So he's like, yeah, the Senate sends us, and the Commodus's bodyguards jump him, and that's the end of it. But the issue is then Commodus can't trust anybody, right? He's a kid, and his sister just tried to kill him, so he goes off the deep end. But it takes a really long time for this, for him to actually be assassinated. So Marcus dies in 180. Commodus is assassinated on New Year's Eve of 192 to 193. Right. So Commodus is actually there for a long time. And in the first movie, he's there for like a minute and a half, you know? So I think that's one of the challenges is,
And didn't
you know,
Commodus like kind of travel with Marcus Aurelius around and stuff? Didn't he like take him on military campaigns and stuff to kind of groom him?
yeah,
Uh,
he was training him. And he started doing that when he was like a young teenager, so he actually, it's clear to everybody he's going to be the successor. Marcus is training him, but Marcus is in terrible health. um, he is like in every view of everybody forever the ideal emperor, but he's also an opium addict and he's in serious physical pain. The job of emperor is really rough, and he spends most of his time traveling around on campaign in Germany. And oh, by the way, smallpox is happening, right? So it's like not an easy time to be emperor. Plus, Commodus is supposed to be getting this training, and Marcus knows at the time he dies, the Commodus's training is not complete. He doesn't really understand how to do things. And so one of the things that Marcus says to his associates is he says, look, like he says, in essence, I didn't get to finish this. So I want you to be kind of the stand-in father for Commodus and make sure that he learns everything he needs to learn so that he can run the empire effectively. And the first couple of years, like Commodus is not great, not super inspiring, but he's fine. And then this coup attempt happens. And, it's totally natural that this guy would lose it, right? Like the person kind of closest to him has tried to get him killed. And so what ends up happening is Commodus starts taking self-defense classes. He starts learning from like all of the different ways to fight that people in various parts of the Roman Empire had learned. And so he learns how to fight like a Moroccan. He learns how to fight like someone from Gaul. He learns how to fight like somebody from North Africa. And he gets
How
actually
did
really, really
Moroccans
good.
fight, Ed? You're the historian. What did Moroccans
Yeah,
do? I mean,
I think that the thing that they say, I can't remember exactly what like what tactics like line up, but he becomes really really good with javelins, and I think that that's a Moroccan way to do it. Not like throw it far, but throw it accurately. And so as Commodus gets better at this, he starts taking this training from in the palace to like the wider world. And he starts performing, feats in the Colosseum that are actually pretty remarkable. Like there is a moment where Cassius Dio was a historian who was also a senator and was attended these things. He said that he's at an event in the Colosseum and Commodus kills, I think it's 100 lions with 100 javelins. He doesn't miss once. And so he's
I
really
mean, what are the
actually
what are,
quite
what are the
good.
Lions doing at this time? I mean, are they?
Uh, it's not totally clear what, basically, like, if you were to go to a game in the Colosseum, what you would see, and we actually have an example of this where the paint still survives. The walls of the Colosseum and the arenas around the empire are actually painted. And then you would include like plants and rocks and other things to set up a natural environment that replicates where this animal is in theory from. And so in Beit Sha'an in Israel, there is actually still on the walls of the amphitheater there, you can still see trees painted that are, 1700, 1800 years old. And so what you would have is a whole like stage set where you have these animals walking around in a environment that looks kind of like North Africa, and the thing for the venator, so the person who's actually like performing this hunt, is they're supposed to basically like replicate the experience of hunting a lion in North Africa, because all of these lions are North African lions, um, and so Commodus does this, and it's like this isn't normal, right? People aren't that good. He's really good. And this is one of the things that like the people writing about this have to acknowledge. They basically have to say, look, like, yeah, it's not appropriate for an emperor to be doing this, but man, he's actually pretty good. And
So
so,
really,
so it
really, in
becomes,
the end of the first movie, he might not have had to stab Russell Crowe, Maximus, right? He could have given him an even match. I mean,
oh my God, he would have
Commodus
killed him.
Commodus in the movie is not a hardy, scrappy guy.
Not at all. And so Commodus, so at the moment that Commodus is actually killed, there had been a big fire that ripped through the center of Rome and burned a lot of the Forum, and it burned the Imperial Palace. And so Commodus was actually living in like a villa that was in the center of Rome, right next to this whole complex. So the Colosseum is, the arena where public gladiatorial fighting happens. But if you go outside of the Colosseum and you walk the other direction from the Forum, you'll see the remains of the Ludus Magnus, which is the space where gladiators trained. And the whole area around there is actually a complex of barracks and hospitals and other things. And Commodus was living in a villa in basically the gladiator district. Um, and so when Commodus is assassinated, he's assassinated, in this space that is like right next to the hospital where gladiators are treated when they get hurt. Um, and the story about his assassination is utterly crazy because it's not an army that overthrows Commodus. It's not the Praetorian Guards that overthrows Commodus. It's his mistress and a couple of like senior officials, and they first try to poison him. But he's so robust, he's so strong, he's in such good shape that the poison actually doesn't really work. And so he goes to like take a bath, And then they send in, according to the story, and there's all sorts of problems with the story, they then send in a wrestler, and the wrestler strangles him in the bath. And so it takes a combination of poison and a wrestler to kill Commodus. So if you think like a general, and most Roman generals are in their like late 30s or 40s, he's not going to be able to take out Commodus. Like this is a guy who is hardcore. Like he really is not like some middle-aged guy who can show up and like beat Commodus. Like you're not gonna, that's not going to happen. Like Commodus would actually be able to take down Russell Crowe for sure.
Now, this is something in the film that happens. There's a water scene where they actually have these ships and they're simulating a naval battle. No,
Yeah,
I did some research on this. There were hydraulic ducts in the Coliseum, right? They actually could
yeah,
fill this thing with water, right? I mean, this actually could happen.
yeah. It could, and it did. We don't know how often, but like when Titus opened the Colosseum, there was a naval battle in it. There's also a space in Rome called the Nomachia, which literally means like a place where ships fight. We don't know for sure how often that was used for naval battles. There's some thinking that maybe that was basically a place that also took water during floods. But like naval battle sort of combat was something Romans did pretty regularly, and in the Colosseum you could definitely do it. The issue that you have though is the depth of the Colosseum. So there's a couple of like logistical limiting factors with the Colosseum and naval battles. The first limiting factor is, the walls are relatively tall, but the walls do a couple things. I mean, first, they can contain the water, but the second thing, and this is really, I mean, the movie actually even shows some of this problem. There's a real risk in any Roman arena, Roman amphitheater, that the stuff that goes on the floor can go out into the seats. And so there are all of these mechanisms where you have to raise the walls up around the floor so that animals don't jump up and get people, so that gladiators don't like throw something and kill somebody. And you have netting that then sort of projects over, but it's not super tall. So if you're going to have ships in there, you're not going to have anybody with arrows, right? That's crazy. You're not going to have anybody with javelins. That's crazy also. And you also basically have to sail like flat bottom ships. And you really are going to struggle with banks of oars because, you can't have that much water in there, right? Like the floor of the Colosseum is like, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 feet below the level of the wall. And then you have the netting and other things that project out. So you can't put too much water in there. You could fill it up to like maybe, I'm guessing, like 4 feet or something.
I mean, in the
But you
movie, they
can't,
have they have sharks swimming around in there. Were there
yeah,
sharks? Did they have sharks?
that's an argument, but it is impossible. So I actually have an undergraduate student who's writing a thesis on Roman animals and the effect on the ecology of animal life in the Mediterranean from Roman games. And this is his thinking, which I totally trust. He's brilliant about this stuff. So Greg, a shout out to you. But what Greg basically says is like, first of all, we now cannot keep great white sharks in captivity. Like they don't survive. And so getting great white sharks into the Colosseum is effectively impossible because you would have to catch them and transport them. And we couldn't do that now. So there's no way that Romans could actually do that. But then, the other thing is sharks don't like eating people.
What did they do with the shark in Happy Days? How did they make that happen where Fonzie jumps the shark?
Yeah, I don't know.
I
I don't
guess they
know.
didn't. I guess they just got the shark in a cage in the ocean.
So you can get some sharks, but again, I'm trusting my student who I
I mean,
do trust. But
this is descended to a new low because I'm referencing Happy Days, but the jump
yeah,
the shark,
but
that's
you
the ultimate.
some sharks you can actually keep in captivity. But these seem to be great whites, and those you cannot. Again, like I'm trusting my student, but he says, look, like you can't do that. You can't do that now. Like you don't see great white sharks in aquariums because you can't actually keep them alive. They don't do well. And so
Are you telling
you
your
could
student
have a
just
shark.
are you telling your student just run with this because you're going to be the guy for the next 30 years on Roman ecology, right? I mean, it's got to be a pretty specific subfield. He could dominate it.
Yeah, no, he just like knows this stuff. So Greg Barnum, you are the Roman ecology like future star.
I'm going to
Um,
remember when, hey, there were just references to this guy in Give and Take, and now he's doing Hollywood consults on Gladiator 3.
yeah, he would not allow you to do the great white sharks though. But yeah, so what you do have with the Roman games is a really developed ecosystem of getting animals and bringing them from wherever they are to wherever they're supposed to be. But there are real challenges in doing that. And the farther you have to bring these animals, the more likely they are to die. And so the percentage that survive is not super high, and so trapping these animals and getting them to roam is difficult. But doing it for an aquatic animal is basically impossible. You could maybe get something like freshwater eels, or something freshwater you could maybe work. But as far as I know, the Colosseum was not ever filled with salt water. Um, and obviously, if you put a saltwater fish in freshwater, you have a big problem. So,
See, this is why I'm glad I have you here, right? I mean, all these things. I'm glad we didn't have this conversation before the film, though, because I was having a good time watching the sharks. But no, these twin emperors Geta and Caracalla, are these real figures?
yeah, Caracal and Gator are real figures. They are not like that though.
All
So
right. So what
so
did they get wrong?
the moment we're in the early part of the third century is a really, really important moment in Roman history, and Caracal is actually a really, really important emperor. Um, but between the death of Commodus. Commodus actually dies again, like New Year's Eve of 192 to 3. And when Caracalla and Geta are actually in charge, you have a whole sort of revolution in the way that the state is working. So you have two emperors who take power very quickly and lose power very quickly, and then a large civil war. But one of those emperors, the Emperor Pertinax, is actually said to have been born in, a slave. So you have there somebody who is like really kind of climbed up the Roman hierarchy very, very quickly in just one lifetime. And then the emperor who wins the civil war is named Septimius Severus, and he's from Africa. And we actually have a painted portrait of Septimius Severus and his family, where Septimius Severus is a dark-skinned African. Now, what does that mean? I mean, the conception of race is very different in antiquity from what it is now. But between Septimius Severus and then Macrinus, who is in the film, those are your two emperors where people would look at this and say, look, like these are, if there was a black African or a sub-Saharan African, like skin tones Roman emperor, it's one of these two. And Macrinus, I think, is more likely than Septimius Severus. So the casting of Denzel for Macrinus is actually awesome because like he's a Moor, that our sources tell us, and also notably, our sources say he wore an earring, and Denzel wears an earring in this, so that's pretty awesome. But with Caracal and Geta, Septimius Severus dies and leaves the empire to his sons Caracal and Geta, and they hate each other. And so the real history is that Caracalla summons Geta on basically Christmas Eve of 211, and Geta won't go by himself because he doesn't trust his brother. So they have their mother go with them. And Caracalla personally kills Geta in his mother's arms and then prohibits his mother from crying about it. And then Caracalla goes and he celebrates his victory over the threats from Geta by extending citizenship to every single person in the Roman Empire. And so Caracalla is the person who basically changes Rome from a colonial enterprise to a nation state. It's actually a really, really significant moment. But then Caracalla feels so guilty about killing his brother that he spends most of his reign traveling with the army, visiting shrines to make himself feel better, and like doing things like sleeping on the ground with his soldiers and eating rations that his soldiers eat. Um, and and so he's not wearing makeup, right? He doesn't have a pet monkey. Like all of these things, like that's not Caracalla at all. But after Macrinus takes power from Caracalla, Macrinus reigns for a very short period of time, and the person who follows him is the Emperor Elagabalus, who would potentially be like, we know he wore silk clothing, we know he wore makeup, we know that he was very, very strange, very into this kind of court behavior that you see in the movie. And so I think what you have is a kind of flipping of Elagabalus for Caracalla and Gaeta, but the actual Caracalla would bear no resemblance whatsoever to the Caracalla in the movie. But Elagabalus, who follows Macrinus, actually would. Right. So I think there's some stuff going on there that is a little bit interesting.
I'm curious how you label this genre wise, right? Because I think when we think of something like historical fiction, we think of something that largely follows storylines that we know in history, something like the movie Lincoln or something, right? And then takes creative license within that framework, but doesn't swap around major characters and things like that. I mean, what do you, as a historian, how do you refer to a movie like Gladiator or Gladiator 2 genre wise?
I think it's an action movie that takes place in Rome, right? Like in a way, it's kind of like almost alternative non-science fiction. Um, because I think what you can imagine is uh, like if you were to think about like a D&D game where you have archetypical Roman characters and you just kind of scatter them in a certain way that's potentially possibly a narrative that could exist in Rome, but not really, not an actual narrative. What you have there are a bunch of archetypes, archetypical Roman figures that you just kind of put on a game board and you make a story out of them. And all of those types of figures, I mean, the time between Caracalla and Gaeta taking power and the death of Elagabalus is very short. It's like a decade basically. And so these people are all there roughly at the same time as each other. And you have senators who are very traditionalist, and you have um, Macrinus, who really does orchestrate a very effective coup against Caracalla. That is, I mean, it's like remarkable because no one really wanted Caracalla. No one in power with the power to take out Caracalla wanted him dead, and Macrinus managed to get him dead anyway. Um, and so I think what you have here is like a set of archetypical like Roman action figures that you just place down basically roughly in the 210s, and you have them kind of play out a scene. And in that sense, it largely works. So it's
I,
not implausible, but it's not what happened at all.
I'm wondering psychologically, as a historian, when you go to see a movie like this that's in your specialty, I mean, what do you have to do to prepare? I mean, do you have to be like, all right, I'm not going to be the guy that nudges my family, like, couldn't happen. Couldn't. That's so fake. That's so fake. No way. No way. I mean, what do you do to prepare so that you can enjoy the film?
So I've seen the movie twice. I saw it on opening night with my wife, and my wife said the condition is that you cannot say anything about why this movie's bad, and you cannot laugh during it. And so I said, okay, that's fine.
So you
Um,
meaning that you would do laugh, like mocking, deriding laughter.
there were a couple things that were like ridiculous, where like the sharks, yeah, okay, that was ridiculous. I did laugh at that, and she's like, but but then the second time I saw it, I taught a class this fall where it was an undergraduate class, and I asked them, "What do you want to learn about Roman history?" And we took the narrative out. We're just like, "You want to learn about coins? We'll do coins. You want to learn about battles? We'll do battles. You want to learn about women? We're going to do some stuff on Roman women. You don't have to know any of the context. We're not going to do like the whole history of Rome. These are like freshmen and sophomores. If you want to, these are just 10 things you want to learn about Rome. Let's learn about it." And the students asked to do a class session to see Gladiator 2. So we did. So so I took the class, and we all went and saw Gladiator
No,
2.
you are after this the coolest professor on campus for what, like a week? Is everybody going, what did you guys do today? Well, we went to see Gladiator 2.
Yeah. So I don't know, I don't know if they thought that, but I said, afterwards, if you want, it's totally optional. We'll have like a hate watching party. We'll go get pizza after, and we'll just talk about everything that we liked and didn't like. And so we did that, and that was actually really fun because the students had very different backgrounds, very different like interests, and so there were some who were critiquing like the depiction of Roman infrastructure because they're engineers and they're kind of looking at this as something that like didn't seem plausible to them. Some of the elements that you see there. Some of the people looking at military tactics were like, yeah, I mean, you don't really take a city by sea the way that they did in the opening scenes of the movie. The first time I know that someone did that was the Crusaders, the Venetians taking Constantinople, like 1,000 years after this movie takes place, right? So it's not really, so that was the kind of stuff we talked about. But the point of that with the students was they do know about this. They don't know as much about Roman history in like totality as a professor does, but the stuff they are interested in, they know a lot about, right? They know about military tactics if they're interested in military tactics. My student Greg knows tons about Roman animals because he's super interested in Roman animals. And so when you then get together with the students after watching the movie, there's all of these perspectives on like what was done well and what was weird, and and what was like comically bad, and what was super interesting, and so that's a different kind of experience than like be quiet, don't hate watch, right? um,
Yeah, one of the things that struck me in this film, there was actually one reference to Christianity. In the first Gladiator movie, there's no references, not a single one. And I don't think you see a single Christian. And that takes place at the end of the 2nd century. This is early 3rd century. There's one reference when they're talking about crucifying, uh, um, when they're talking about crucifying Lucilla and her husband, and Denzel Washington says, Macrina says, no, you can't. That's for thieves and Christians. And that was the only reference. Now, of course, I mean, Christianity. I mean, I've read figures that the early church was growing by like 30% a decade. So even though it's a minority at that time, it's a fast growing minority. I mean, it seems curious to me that Christianity is so absent from the film at all. But given the period, do you think that's actually feasible? I mean, maybe it wasn't that dominant of a force like it was in the 4th century.
yeah, no, I think it's so. The estimate that you're quoting is from Rodney Stark's Rise of Christianity, and which I think actually, I mean, I believe that. I think that is plausible. But I think the first thing is you start with a really low base, right? You start with like 30 people, and so it takes a
There's
long
no
time,
place
even
to
with
go
that.
but up.
Right. Well, and like you start with that level of growth, and like 10% a decade, 30 people is 33 people, right? Like it augments very quickly. And what Stark does with that work is he shows, this is totally plausible because like Mormonism grows at that rate.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so it is, so we see it and we can see it, and it does make some sense. I think so I think in the movie, there is a subtle reference to Christianity too at the beginning, which I think is intriguing. Um, because Lucius Verus refuses the sacrifice before the battle. The very beginning, right? He refuses, and it's acknowledged. And then they talk about potentially crucifying his mother. And Denzel says, no, that's because of Christianity. And well, um, I think you actually, if you want to read a Christian subtext into it, there you go.
So,
I think
so you're
I think
saying Lucius' refusal of the sacrifice is him being is them depicting him as not a Christian, because that would have been a typical Christian
This
thing to not do
in
that
the
sort of
early
stuff.
third century, that is actually what Christians would do. So before Caracalla extends citizenship to everybody, the Roman government has a kind of really rough idea even of what kinds of activities people are performing in their cities. The first empire-wide Christian persecution doesn't happen until 249. And when it happens, it is actually accidental. There's an emperor named Decius who decides that the reason the empire, like make Rome great again, the reason the empire is struggling is because Romans are not actually doing traditional religious activity anymore, and the gods are angry. And so he mandates that everybody has to go before a government official, perform a sacrifice, and get a receipt for it. Because Caracalla has extended citizenship to everybody, all of a sudden, instead of like 6 million people in Italy doing this, it's 60 million people across the entire Mediterranean doing this. And even though Decius doesn't understand this, he started the first empire-wide persecution of Christians because a bunch of Christians who before could just say, yeah, I don't really feel like sacrificing, I want to go do this instead, can't do that now because they need to have this receipt. And so what you actually see in that opening scene is exactly what a Christian would do in this context. They'd be like, yeah, like I gave it the office, or yeah, like I don't really want to do that right here, right now. But I prayed my own way, and it would be fine until 249, and then it's not fine because you have to have this receipt. So what's going on in, like, if we're assuming this is 211, which doesn't work chronologically, but whatever. If we assume that this is like when Caracalla and Gita are both in charge of the empire, which is the year 211, there are Christian persecutions that happen, but they're rare. So the most famous one that is roughly in that time period is Perpetua and Felicitas. So these are two martyrs in North Africa. And we actually have what I think, and a lot of people think, is a journal, a text based on a journal kept by one of these women, Christian women who are imprisoned. And then there's a continuation when they're actually brought out to be executed. The execution is actually in the Colosseum. It is in an arena in the city of Carthage. And it's done to celebrate Gita's birthday. It's in, I think, 203 AD. And what they do, because the two, Perpetua and Felicitas, one of them had just given birth, and is still, she still is lactating, and so they decide to have them killed by a mad cow, thinking that this would be funny. And when they bring them out, the crowd starts booing and like is horrified that anyone would think this is a good idea. And so they have to like put them back, bring them back, and then kill them in a different way. But what that shows is, I think, a few things. I mean, first of all, there aren't many moments where you're killing Christians publicly because they don't know how to do it, right? Like, if you are putting on games at the birthday of a member of the imperial family, you want these to be really like gangbusters, right? You want people really excited and happy. You don't want people booing. And so clearly they don't know how to kill Christian women in a way that's like appealing to the crowds. Um, and so that, I think, shows, first of all, they're not doing this very often. And then second of all, when they're doing it, it's probably very rare,
That is one of the
and they
greatest
don't know how to do it.
arguments I've ever heard. They're probably not doing a lot because they're crowd pleasers and they can't please the crowds. So
Right.
you would have had
Well,
producers, right? People that are producing games, like, and they knew how to produce.
yeah, exactly. Because what these things do, all of these games that are put on, they're put on to honor somebody and they're put on to show off. And so, so when people put on games, it's usually because you're starting or you've reached the pinnacle of your political career and you want to demonstrate your power, your authority, your wealth. You want to show out like how great you are. And so if the games fail, right, if they're not fun, or you can't get good animals, and so you have just a bunch of like farm animals running around, that looks bad for you. But if you're honoring an emperor, not only does it look bad for you, but it, like, by extension, makes the emperor look bad, and you're going to get in some trouble. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to kill you because you put on bad games, but you're also not going to get like a nice office. You're not going to get like imperial honors. Like you're not going to get the kind of um, currency that really matters in building a reputation for yourself. So it's really bad actually to put on bad games.
Wasn't this like this period just made for Donald Trump? Can you imagine Trump as like an emperor? But they like, look, I'm doing like the best games. Okay, they're cheering the loudest. Like, I mean, we get the lions and the monkeys, and I mean, we're killing the Christian. I mean, these are like, I mean, they're saying like the historians, they're writing like Trump has the best games. I mean, they're saying, I mean, wouldn't that? I mean, this is what Trump. He could just live to produce these things.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting. I think a way to think about it when you think about these kinds of combats and the activity in gladiatorial contexts, um, this is, I think, a lot more like professional wrestling than it is like the NFL, right? Like the biggest entertainment in Rome is chariot racing. Like it's not as interesting to us because like we kind of still like to have horse racing, right? We kind of still have people who do this kind of racing, and it's not very popular anymore. Um, but if you're a Roman and you're like, I'm a sports fan, the big sport is chariot racing. Gladiatorial combat is more niche. It's the NHL, it's not the NFL. I mean, that's
And
kind of overstating it, but
I read recently, only like 1 in 10 gladiators died in the arena.
oh yeah, no, because they're expensive. So most gladiators, nearly all gladiators, are slaves. They are very highly trained. The whole like Gladiator 2 actually does this better than Gladiator 1. In Gladiator 1, you just have like, okay, we're gonna trot out 100 guys, and Russell Crowe is gonna slaughter them all in like 4 seconds. And that is not how it would have worked at all. Because and the Gladiator 2 actually makes a comment about this in the very beginning, where there's supposed to be a fight that's not to the death, and most gladiator fights are not to the death. And Caracal and Gita say, no, we want it to the death. And after one of them dies, they said, wow, he looked like he was very expensive. This is actually what gladiator combat was. These are very highly trained people. So I'm a Mets fan. You can kind of see that over my head too. Like
I'm sorry to hear
imagine,
that. I'm very sorry. It's a
yeah,
brutal form
whatever.
of existence.
Whatever, Philly fan. um, so like imagine if you have a display and it's going to be like Juan Soto and Shohei, and and they're just supposed to display their talents, right? It's an at bat. And if Shohei strikes out Soto, then like his Dodgers get like some money. If Soto gets a hit off of Otani, then the Mets get some money, and then like they all go home. And then all of a sudden you show up and somebody's like, yeah, no, it's to the death. And if Otani strikes him out, then yeah, guess what? Like that's it. You lose Otani. He's not here anymore. Or if Soto gets a hit off Otani, Otani's gone. If Soto strikes out, then Soto's gone. Right? That's actually what gladiatorial combat would have been like. Like these are very, very well trained, um, with many years experience, and the combat is very well regulated too. So there are different types of gladiators that only fight other types, and match up in a very specific way. And there's techniques that you have to learn to fight in those ways. And there's counter techniques. It's a very complicated thing, and so it's incredibly wasteful. And you would not want a top tier gladiator fighting to the death. It would be an incredible loss to you. And these we actually have some tombstones from gladiators, and there's one of them, and I cannot remember exactly how it's framed, but he basically says, this is my record, and the last fight I lost because of a bad call by the ref.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
so
See,
you know
this
so
is the
most
stuff you
of
don't
them
know.
yeah so most of them are, it's a job. It's not like I'm gonna fight once and maybe die. Like, think how boring that would be. Um, the combat would not last very long. If you had a very trained gladiator against somebody who didn't know what they were doing, it wouldn't be interesting, and it would be incredibly wasteful. Uh, and it would be wasteful for everybody. And it's not like Romans have a very modern appreciation for the sanctity of human life. They don't really have a significant problem with someone dying in the arena, but they don't want it to happen very often, um, for a number of reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is if these people only fight once, they're not going to fight well. It's not going to be interesting. You don't want a gladiator who only fights once because they're not going to be very good.
Yeah, I'm curious. This period, this early third century. I mean, it's depicted in the film as just terrible, right? I mean, just this. It's almost like the Empire in Star Wars, right? People are oppressed. There's a looming shadow. Um, I mean, you're saying that one of these emperors actually gets universal citizenship. That seems like good thing, not bad thing for the average Roman. I mean, at this period, how was life for the average Roman? Good time to be alive as a Roman, bad time to be alive.
Caracalla is a rough person to try to figure out. There are these figures in Roman history where you look at them and you're like, how do you balance the good and the bad? Because some of what Caracalla does, is incredibly productive. I mean, by extending universal citizenship in the way he does, that process, if he had not done that, um, it would have taken, the way that it was working before he extended universal citizenship, like kind of by fiat, it would have taken centuries for you to actually get to that point. So it is really a revolutionary thing that makes Rome a completely different kind of society. And a lot of the challenges of the third century is, the state figuring out how now all of a sudden you deal with a situation where most Romans lived as more or less colonial subjects under their own local laws with limited rights in an imperial context. Now all of a sudden they all have imperial rights, and we have all kinds of like court cases and other things where we see how the state struggles to do this. um, so that on the one hand is like an incredibly positive thing that Caracalla does, but Caracalla is also extremely vicious, right? I mean, he not only kills his own brother and like prevents his mother from grieving, but he also, we're told, like massacres a large number of people in the city of Alexandria for reasons that nobody really was totally sure. They basically made him mad, but we don't know why. But thousands of people died, so he's a really complicated figure. um, and the third century after Caracalla is really a moment where the empire has to figure out what it means, to be kind of a Roman nation state that includes all of these people who are, they don't seem like what Romans used to seem like. And Elagabalus is a great example of this, right? He's the priest of a Syrian god. And when we think of like the representations of Roman gods, they look like people, right? They're anthropomorphized. His god was an asteroid. And he comes to Rome and he brings the god in and he celebrates a giant procession, and he introduces this asteroid to Rome, and he says like, this is, I'm the emperor and this is now like the god that we all should place above all of our other gods. Um, the empire's not ready for that. They're not ready for somebody who dresses like a boy emperor who brings an asteroid god and dresses in silk and dances around and like does these things that to Romans seem really weird. Um, but on one level, that's the promise of the world that Caracalla has created, and on another level, they're not ready for it. And so the third century is a difficult time to be alive. It's really difficult for the state to figure out how to be what Caracalla began. How to actually realize the potential of the society that he created. Um, but it is a society with places for people like Macrinus, who was not a senator. The movie gets that right. Um, he was very much a Roman outsider. And the senators, when they talk about the reign of Macrinus, they say things like, I mean, he actually would have been a great emperor, but he shouldn't have been emperor because he wasn't a senator. But that's actually, as the third century progresses, that's not actually going to be a problem in the future, right?
Mm.
You will have emperors who aren't senators. You will have emperors who don't look like regular, ordinary Italian Roman senators look like. They're different. but there's a space for that, and the empire becomes better because of that. But it is a difficult, difficult process to get from where the empire was in 200 and where the empire will be in 300.
I mean, it's very interesting. The Emperor twins say to Pedro Pascal's character, General Cassius, they basically want him to. He's just come back from this campaign conquering in North Africa, and he's exhausted, right? And they're like, all right, on to India, Persia, and he just says, I mean, he is not sympathetic. He's like, you got to feed all these people. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, it isn't this the challenge of empire, right? How do you not break under the weight of too much expansion, right? And is this?
Yeah.
I mean, is expansion? I mean, sometimes expansion can bring life to an empire. Sometimes you're spread too thin. Is this a time when Rome's spreading itself a little too thin? Does the movie get that right?
No, the expansion is really slowed down. There are expansions under Caracalla and Septimius Severus, but they really are in the east, and they involve absorbing more or less client kingdoms. These vassals of the Roman state that they absorb and they incorporate into the Roman state. And there is a war with Persia that Septimius Severus, or the Parthians, because the Persians emerge in the 220s. But the war with the Parthians does really weaken the Parthian state, and Rome takes some territory from it. But we're really talking about, at the beginning of Septimius Severus's reign, this is an empire that's basically, more or less the size of Australia. It's really big, and it has been really big for a long time. The last big territorial expansion had occurred 100 years before under Trajan, right? So it's a steady state kind of thing. You're defending your territory. You're building ways to incorporate the people living in that territory better into your society. And the expansion under Septimius Severus and Caracalla is significant, but it's not massive. It's not, expansion that's going to distort the Roman state. And there's no thought at that moment of going to India. Trajan had taken over 100 years before. Trajan had taken over basically what's now the core of modern Iraq, and they couldn't hold it. And it was impossible to hold it. So basically, Rome is not going to do that.
What made it impossible? Just the supply line's too far. It's just not. I mean, why couldn't they hold it?
I mean, when you look at that region, it's the same thing the U.S. faced when they were trying to hold that region. You basically cannot control Mesopotamia if you cannot actually control the access into Mesopotamia from the mountains in Iran. And what the Parthians did to Trajan is basically the same thing that we saw Iran do, right? You pull supply lines back into the mountains, and you run insurgencies using those supply lines in the cities of Mesopotamia, and that's lowland. And so you're fighting lowland insurgencies, and you can't trace the support of the insurgency. You can't attack the people supporting that insurgency without going into mountains. And could Rome have held that territory? Maybe. But the Emperor Hadrian basically said, we don't know we can hold this. This is super expensive, and it's pointless, because even if we hold it temporarily, the attacks from the mountains can always happen. And Iran is a big and powerful place, right? Historically, the Persians and Iranians, that is a center of significant power. And it is very difficult for outsiders to control it. It happens a few times in history with Alexander the Great, mainly because the Iranian government makes huge mistakes, the Arabs, and the Mongols. But it's very rare for people to do this, and it is extremely rare for someone to take Iran from the West, right? It's really kind of two times in history that you really have that happen. So, so it really just wasn't feasible to take that territory.
You've written a great book called Mortal Republic, which we've talked about on the show before, and a book I love and I've recommended to lots of people. But in that book, you chronicle the fall of sort of the golden age of the Republic, the best days of the Republic, into autocracy. And it's a great book for any of the listeners that haven't read it. It's incredibly applicable to modern life, because you talk about how republics don't end by violation of laws. It's violation of norms, right? where is this period, the early third century, in the life of Rome, as far as you kind of chronicle a really good time that sort of slides into an autocracy. I mean, how do you describe this period? How do you rate it? Is this, how does it fare alongside other epochs in the history of the empire?
I just sent off a history of the Roman state from beginning to end. So 8th century BC to 1204 AD, which should be out in the fall. And I think what you have here is the kind of the moment where, I mean, if you want to talk about the death knell of an imperial structure that was built on the sort of ashes of the Republic and the beginning of um, a much more effective and powerful and well integrated Roman state. And the third century is a very difficult time because one model for how the empire works is dying, and another model for how the empire works is struggling to be born. And by the time you get out of the third century, they've figured it out. You have a way for this state to work that actually provides to all of its citizens more or less equally, not equally based on every person, but equally based on every region, the resources that are available to support Roman life. Defensive support, administrative support. Your taxes go and are sent back in a way that is much more efficient because they tend to stay in the region, as opposed to the old imperial model where they would go to Italy and stay in Rome and maybe come back out, but not really quite often. The third century is much more wealthy and secure. The fourth century is much more economically productive. People are much wealthier. The state is much more secure. It's much more robust. It can do a lot more for its citizens, and it does, and it tries to do much more for its citizens. In the third century, you have kind of the architecture of a state designed really to extract stuff from the territories that Rome controls and send it back to Italy so that Italians can benefit. And you have citizens who are like, wait, we're all citizens now. Why are you doing that? And so the third century is really this imbalance between what citizens expect and what the state delivers. By the end of the third century, Rome figures it out, and the state that emerges is a much more capable state, a state that is kind of productive and efficient on a level of kind of an early modern state. So, I mean, to give one example that I love, the Roman state in 300 AD mints as many coins a year, or mints so many coins a year that production is not matched again until the end of the 19th century. So no other state in the history of the world mints as many coins a year as the Roman state in 300 AD, until you get basically to around the year 1900.
I'm just trying to
So
think, what kind of technology are they using to make coins back then? I mean, that's amazing.
it's handmade. You have people who carve the dies by hand. They then, each coin, you have a die, it's, metal, metal thing. You pour molten metal into it, you hammer it down with a hammer, and they're producing, tens of millions of these every year.
Wow.
So this is why if you go on eBay, you want to buy a coin of Constantine, you can find an actual legitimate 1700-year-old coin of Constantine, and you can get it for $20.
Well, I know what I'm getting for holiday gifts. I hope it's not. I've got to get. I've got to get my delivery package with eBay up to speed here, because that is a great holiday here. From me to you, a coin of Constantine. All right, Ed. What do you give the movie for our listeners as we wrap up here? What kind? How many stars do you give it, and what's your synopsis review of the film?
So let's do it Gladiator style, right? I'll give it a thumbs up, right? I think the movie should live. um, and I think what's interesting about it is you do really have a sense of a different Rome than you would from, say, watching like a Spartacus movie. And there are aspects of that Rome that are like comical and exaggerated, but there are aspects of that Rome that actually, I think, it's useful to think about this. And it's also, I mean, it's a good story. Like a Roman historian who looks at this would be like, yeah, okay, that didn't happen in that way, and some of these things couldn't happen in that way. But again, like if you see this as it's a good story, and these people that you're seeing on the screen, they are archetypes. They are like action figures of kind of Romans who were alive in the third century, and they didn't interact in this way necessarily, but people like them existed. I think that it's really fun. And so it's a fun movie. It's also a fun movie if you know anything about Rome or you have an interest in some aspect of Rome. I mean, part of the fun of a movie like this is then you can sit down with your friends and you can kind of rag on the stuff they get wrong. So you can enjoy the movie and also hate watch it afterwards. And, it's fun. So
I mean, for
I
what
think
else do you do
yes.
graduate work in history, right? To hate watch historical films, right? I mean,
But you know what they
it's.
said? There's a great scene in Succession where where Shiv is talking to one of the sons of this other media family, and he's like, "Oh, I got a PhD from Brown and whatever," and she's like, "Why did you spend 7 years so that you can be 3 seconds faster than Google?"
Well, Ed, you are at least 8 seconds faster. It's amazing. Uh, Thanks for spending some time talking about the film with me and my audience.
Absolutely, this was a lot of fun.